Welcome, Strategy Simplified listeners. Today we get to speak with Hans Dau, CEO of Mitchell Madison Group. Hans is a global leader in optimizing cross-sector supply chains, and today we'll get to hear about the trends in this space and how Mitchell Madison is helping firms adapt, as well as more about Hans and the Mitchell Madison Group overall. I hope you enjoy the discussion. We are so pleased to have Hans Dau with us today, the CEO of Mitchell Madison Group. Really appreciate you taking some time joining with us today. Excited to get to know a little bit more about you and your firm, of course. We have a couple of fun questions prepared to get to know you off the top, and then we'll dive into more about the firm. But so Hans, what is one career that you could have gone into but didn't?
Well, not that exciting. I think I came out of banking originally. I spent some couple of years as an equity analyst in Wall Street, and there was an opportunity to go into investment banking. It was, when I graduated from Dartmouth, from Tuck Business School, there was a lot of recruiting going on in Europe with the big investment banks. But honestly, I just did not want to be in Europe. I'm German originally, obviously. And I was being heavily recruited by the banks as sort of, after German reunification, there was a lot of transactional work being done, and I turned that down. And I guess all the people that interviewed me got incredibly rich, and I ended up in consulting. But I still loved it, so I don't regret it. I wanted to be in the United States. That was essentially the main thing for me.
Looking at your Malibu pad, Hans, it looks like it turned out okay for yourself, right?
Well, all the people interviewed me have yachts and stuff like that, so whatever.
I understand. It's all relative. Absolutely. So who is one person from history that you would want to meet, dead or alive?
No, that's interesting. So a little strange question for me because, I recently, I think this is a COVID thing. I became really interested in reading about, physics and especially quantum mechanics. So I think, and I don't know much about this, right? But I have to, sometimes work with these real vector heads, and they all know this. And I work with somebody that had a degree in computational quantum mechanics, whatever the heck that is. And so I became interested in that. And I think any of the people that worked on that would be great, like the Germans, Heisenberg, Max Born, those people, because it's such a weird theory. And it was over 100 years ago. And even today, nobody really understands it. And it would be kind of cool to say, hey, you came up with this stuff, and I'm from 100 years in the future, and people still don't get it. It's an interesting thing. So, I wonder how that would go, that conversation. Absolutely.
See if they could boil it down to make sense to us, even in today's world. I love that. Well, and then one more. What would be your favorite national park?
That's a good question. So you could have asked me that a while ago to maybe change my opinion. So I am like you guys said before. I'm in Jackson Hole a lot of the time, and so there's Yellowstone and the Grand Teton National Park there. Yellowstone is gorgeous. I think it's so unique. It's got half of the world's geysers, and if you're willing to hike more than a mile, you're going to be alone with the geyser because most people are just too lazy to walk. So it's very easy to leave the tourists behind. But then also as part of the pandemic, another pandemic hobby that I picked up is rock climbing. So I have a 13-year-old who is an excellent climber now, and so he drags me to Joshua Tree more, and that's another really, really beautiful park. Both of those I really like. Yeah,
absolutely. So you mentioned that you're based out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a lot of the time, and if someone goes on to the website of Mitchell Madison Group, it'll say, the main office is in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. But where are your clients? Are they spread out across the U.S., internationally?
Yeah, so we basically have been, even pre-pandemic, we were the firm that says, we're a boutique firm, we're about 50, 60 people, right? And sometimes 100, depends. And we never cared where people lived, right? So we always use as a recruiting strength or advantage, like, hey, we don't care. As long as you live by an airport, you can make it to client sites, you can work for MMG, we really don't care. So we've had for many, many years this model where we converge at in a client conference room and do the work there, and then typically, or remote on Fridays, that kind of stuff. And so that was an advantage for us. There is sort of a little office in Jackson. It's kind of like really for me, but I think post-pandemic, there's, I don't think this idea of offices is going to matter. In terms of clients, it's really been all over the world, right? I mean, we have, with the exception of Europe, I would say, we've done, strangely enough, not a ton of work in Europe. We did a lot of work in Asia pre-pandemic. As you might know, we do a lot of supply chain work. So a big part of what we did in maybe, 10 years ago was helping domestic corporations, not offshore, but source globally and kind of like get the whole globalization thing going. And then very strangely, what happened is that, some of the PE firms that were buying Asian companies, even Chinese companies, were coming to us and say, hey, you guys did that. Do you think this would also work within China? And actually it did work. So we very strangely did a lot of work in China, helping them with cost savings and efficiencies. But that's very tough. I mean, I think that required some capability building that we had to do. But I think right now most of our clients are portfolio companies of PE firms. I think that's pretty typical for management consulting now. Mm-hmm. We like working for those guys, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later what we do, but because our differentiation has always been that we do work that's measurable and highly, earnings impactful and maybe less PowerPointy and more results oriented than some of the other guys. Of course, the PE guys were a perfect match for us because that's all they care about, right? Mm-hmm. And so this idea of stripping out the politics and stripping out the organizational dynamics that occur in really large organizations and just working with PE firms just care about the earnings was actually good for us, right? Because that's sort of more where we came from.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so many things in there that I want to dive back into. But let's take a step back. I want to hear a little bit more. You spoke to a previous stint, at least in banking, for yourself. But what's the rest of your journey that's gotten you to where you're at today?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I never thought, it's very interesting. I never thought I would do this. So like most people in life, they never think that they end up where they want to end up. So what basically happened is I was in business school at Dartmouth, like I said, and I got out in 1992, and it was actually 91 was a recession year. And like I said earlier, I just really wanted to be in the US. I love it here, and I feel very happy here. And so most of the recruiting that I did was European focused, or people that wanted me to be in Europe. And I just didn't, especially London, I just didn't want to be there. And so I got a job offer from a bunch of ex-McKinsey guys that were forming a financial services practice at A.T. Kearney, which essentially became MMG. And I took it without too much thinking about it. And I liked it because they were essentially, very entrepreneurial people. They had the intellectual, depth. I really liked them on a personal basis. And that's essentially how I made my career choice. I like those people. And I think that's something that people in general, but particularly in consulting, should always think about. Can they imagine spending, long nights on the whiteboard and, working really hard with these people and enjoy it? And that's kind of what I went with. And I don't regret that. And I think the reason why I stuck with it had partially to do with the fact that I wanted a green card, right? So you have to stick it out for a little while. And then, I always liked the intellectual challenge. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but, I was really into the problem solving and I liked just being almost, on an equal level with people. I liked the interaction of, me and other people with brand new arrivals, new analysts, associates, whatever the title is, and just like duking it out and coming up with the best ideas. And that I really like that. The other thing that I don't know if that's an MMG thing or more broadly true, but MMG hired a whole bunch of people with non-traditional backgrounds, right? So we hired people that, came from, we hired a ton of Caltech people, when Caltech was uncool, right? and so we had a lot of people that with very deep intellectual, totally different backgrounds. And it was just super interesting to work with them. And that kind of, left, resulted in me staying in consulting. I think a lot of people leave after a certain amount of time, but I stayed, and then I moved to the West Coast from New York, and then I think it got a little bit harder because once you're on the West Coast, the travel is a little bit more than compared to when you're in New York, and I think that's sort of the big negative of consulting, right?
So, but that journey brought you to Mitchell Madison Group. You now are CEO. Can you tell us a little bit more about your firm?
Yeah, so the Mitchell, so there's also a checkered, very interesting, I don't know if you know the story, but the Mitchell Madison Group essentially was an McKinsey spinoff, right? And we found a home briefly at A.T. Kearney, and that didn't work out because they were bought by EDS and they didn't tell us. And so people were really upset about that. And so we spun out and in, I want to say 94, and then sold the firm in 2000 to a .com. And that was a complete disaster. And the .com went out of business. It had nothing to do with us, but the .com went out of business and I ran for the hills. We had sold it for I think it was like $500 million. It was an incredible amount of money in 1999 or 2000 for a firm that we were doing, I think, 250 million revenue. It was like 2x revenue, which is, I think, crazy. And then it all went out of business, and I bought it back from bankruptcy for like nothing. And so then I essentially, became an entrepreneur and business owner, and I've been running it more or less by myself since that time. Very interesting experience.
And so what direction have you taken it in? What now are your focus areas?
We'll be right back after this quick break.
Have you ever heard a new digital trend and thought to yourself, okay, does this really matter? Asking the right questions helps you cut through the noise and get down to what matters most. I'm Jim Hertzfeld, host of the What If, So What podcast, where we discover what's possible with digital and figure out how to make it real by asking what if, so what, and most importantly, now what? Subscribe and listen, and together we can turn big ideas into tangible actions so you can get shit done.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, we started out with performance improvement, and we, given the background with A.T. Kearney, we were really strong in strategic sourcing, and I think we still are. I think what we innovated in the last sort of 10 years, I would say, was partially driven by, our necessity to compete with the big guys, right? And so we would always be like, hey, we're very flexible in compensation models. We did a lot of contingency work. Especially on sourcing. I think we really pioneered that in the beginning, where we said, listen, we don't care how you pay us. If you don't believe that we can, have incredible results, then just pay us on success, right? And that was very successful, very stressful, very successful. But it also requires a different kind of firm, right? So when you do this kind of work and you either have an incredibly tight management structure and culture, which we didn't have, right? You can be really, really big and have really strong culture and really great control systems, or you run it a bit like a dictatorship, which is kind of what happened, right? Because you invest in capital, right? So when you're doing like a 9 months project, you have lots of people and you get paid at the end, and you have to like really make sure that you get paid. So those kinds of things tend to, in my experience at least, favor firms that are a little bit small, a little bit tighter run, where, very small number of people make decisions about where to invest working capital. And I think that's what we did. And so based on that success, we, again, we found our ideal match in the PE people, right? They were even more obsessed with earnings than we were. And so that was actually really good. And then we expanded quite a bit into, very analytical, high-end stuff that is, I would say, also related, but more on the revenue side. So we essentially do a lot of pricing optimization work. We do a lot of marketing science, sales analytics type stuff, and we do that with pretty sophisticated machine learning and a lot of data, right? And I think that's so I don't know this stuff personally. I don't have that kind of background, but I have enough background to understand, how data and business practices and the generation of data, the biases inherent in it, how all that interacts and how you can use it to improve performance. So that I really understand. And that's a fascinating area because I think it's not just, I see a lot of clients, jumping on the data analysis bandwagon, and then they're buying a piece of software or they're doing something that sounds grandiose and it never shows a result. So this idea of connecting performance improvement with super complicated, sophisticated analysis and modeling techniques, that's where we're going. And I think that's pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you've been quite successful. You were speaking before to being results focused and driven for your clients. On your website, it says over 5,000 projects globally that have delivered documented performance improvements of over 20%. So that type of kind of, do you still utilize this contingency model? Do you still kind of promise that type of delivery for your clients today?
I mean, yes, we do. We offer it up, and it's a really mixed bag, right? So we do it, and we love doing it because it's far more profitable. The people that end up not liking it are the clients, right? So you get into a lot of situations where it has to be the right kind of client, right? So the absolute best, without giving any secrets away here, but the absolute best contingency deals, you have to have everybody incentivized to in the same way, right? So I had one client, which is a big company, big telecom, and what they did, they essentially put everybody that worked with Mitchell Madison on the same incentive compensation plan that mirrored exactly how we got paid. So that was great, and that worked really well. There's other situations where, that are disaster, right? So if we do strategic sourcing, for example, and the first thing, and we find a bunch of savings, and the first thing the CEO does is fire the chief procurement officer. Well, that's not good for us, right? So there's a bit of a technique and wisdom in doing these things, and we try to help our clients, but that you have to have alignment in goals. And again, that's where the PE guys come in, because the PE guys are not political. They will say, calm down, portfolio company, right? We don't care. We just want the money, and we don't care whose feelings are hurt or who underperformed in the past. We just want to have this stuff work from this point on. So I think there's a very, very complex question. Like I said, I like it. I think it's a good idea, but it requires the right circumstances, right?
We'll be right back after this quick break.
If you're looking to set yourself apart from the competition in what is the most competitive recruiting cycle we've ever seen, join the October cohort of Black Belt. You'll work one-on-one with an MBB coach to get interview ready fast. In between coaching sessions, your coach will assign you targeted homework to shore up your weaknesses. As an added bonus, you'll get access to 3 exclusive group trainings happening in early October. On Friday, October 1st, we're kicking things off with a 2-hour deep dive into case frameworks and math. The following week, we'll do a deep dive into fit interviews. In sum, Black Belt is everything you need to get ready for upcoming interviews. There are just a few spots left in the October cohort. You can grab your spot through the link in the show notes.
And so you've seen success. You've already mentioned a lot of differentiators about Mitchell Madison Group, but what do you think are one of the top 1 or 2 things that really differentiates your firm in the broader consulting space?
Yeah, I feel. I mean, again, it's my impression from clients. I feel that Mitchell Madison is a little bit more on the creative side. I feel, and this might just be the fact that I've been doing it so long, but I feel like we're sort of like old school consultants in the best sense of the world, right? I sometimes think that, when I see, other teams that of bigger firms, and again, because we're small, we have luxury of doing this. We tend to operate with on the ground with senior people, and that get more involved on the problem-solving side than you might see at a big name consulting firm where they're sort of flying in and out. We would probably have less in the middle, and so it's more of an hourglass team structure where we have more experienced people getting the hands dirty, working with analysts to get it all done, and maybe less of a pyramid structure. I also think that we tend to be a little bit more on the complex problem solving side, right? And I think this might be a reflection of me personally also, because I don't want to do work that I don't find interesting. So work that motivates me, I get really involved in the problem solving, and I'm pretty good at that. And so I think that's where you will see us, compared to other firms, come up with some really creative ideas,
Absolutely. So speaking of creativity, the need to be innovative, keep with the times, how have you guys dealt with this COVID era?
Really interesting, right? So I thought about this a lot. So this COVID thing, well, first of all, like with many people, it sort of changed my life, right? So I would, like on a typical week, I would go and make it through LA traffic to the airport, and it's crazy, right? On a Sunday night, and just go to some, and that whole thing is just totally useless, right? I think the business travel that consulting firms were doing was by and large showing FaceTime, right, at the client, and it's just misery, absolute misery, right? And I mean, any honest consultant would admit that the proportion of time where you can actually be productively working is less than 50%, right? You spend so much time traveling, dealing with jet lags, headaches, all this stuff. It's just useless, right? So I think this remote enabled stuff, I was pretty suspicious about this. I wasn't sure whether it's going to work, but we started a project that essentially began at the beginning of COVID, and then Zoom, and it worked fine. It worked totally fine, right? And I think that is going to continue. I think there's going to be maybe even a renaissance with the remote-enabled workforce, forcing consulting that attracts people to the industry, hopefully, that have kids at home, don't want to deal with this stuff, hate airplanes. And I think it's going to be a hybrid model forever. I really hope so, right? But I think it's also requiring a different kind of skill, right? A lot of the skills that consultants bring to the party is networking and client schmoozing and all this kind of stuff. So how do you do this over Zoom? How do you actually network? How do you get something? How do you with this interpersonal dimension? You can't totally ignore it, right? It still happens, but I think it's different. It's a different skill set on Zoom. So like for example, the more introverted person who's very strong analytically, has important things to say, could actually have an advantage, right, in sort of a remote working environment. The person who really wants to be, in a beautiful part of the country, or likes mountain biking or whatever, right, who would never consider living in, Atlanta, Chicago, any of these airport hub places, could now be in consulting, right? So I think this is really interesting. I don't think it's totally shaken out yet across the various, professional services industries, but I don't think it's a negative. I think it's overall going to be quite positive, because it's degrees of freedom, right? Worst case scenario, we go back to how we used to do it. You have more choice, right?
Absolutely. Do you feel like that is starting to change the way that you think about adding folks to your team, the qualities and the traits that you're looking for?
It's a really good question. I have to start thinking about this, right? I mean, it's just, yes, I think we have to get people, you have to be pretty organized, right? The management tool of, okay, let's get all these kids in the conference room and we'll figure it out. That's not available anymore, right? So it's like you used to be able to do that, right? Now you have to be more organized. I think you have to have people that can be organized and are not going to goof off when they're, not constantly, physically present. So I think you have to select for that. I haven't really figured it out yet, but I think that's what we'll have to do. You have to be more organized. You have to have more, you have to use tools more effectively. It's just a slightly higher level of discipline. Strangely enough, right? You have more, but I mean, you have more degrees of freedom. You have more freedom to mess up. So you have to impose self-discipline or some other management technique to stay the course, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, what about the skills and traits you look for more broadly? Thinking about what it takes to be a successful consultant, especially in your space, would love to hear if you have, kind of one or two things that you think are important or that you look for that aren't necessarily a part of the business school curriculum, right? Something that kind of, what are those extra things?
I mean, it's been a while. I just had a business school little get together yesterday, and sort of feel like there's one professor left that hasn't retired yet. So I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So it's been a while. So I think the business schools are making changes to the curriculum, right, to address this. So for sure, data science, understanding data is absolutely critical, and it is being taught right now. They're focusing on that. I think from what I understand, they got rid of statistics and decision science, and it's now more an integrated data science, data analytics type curriculum, which I think makes sense. I think there is a particularly interesting skill set involved in, how do you bridge the gap of, MBAs talking to PhDs and making sense of it all. This sort of like numeracy and this feel for data and working with data sets without getting to the weeds of it, right? There's a way of modeling that leaves you with no insight into the data, if you know what I mean, right? You can model the hell out of data, and then it's like, what does that mean? This whole so what around complex data is something that is an really important skill set. You can kind of learn it, but you have to really look for that. I think if you know that, it's amazing. And then secondly, if you combine that with strong communication skills, as always, you're fantastic, right? But again, like we said earlier, with communication skills, what does that mean in a remote environment, right? For some people, it's great. For some people, it's maybe not so great. But being able to communicate succinctly and drawing conclusions that are actionable and well presented from data, that's more important than ever, right? And it's something we really have to teach. I don't see people being amazing at it out of school, right? At any level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sure a lot of the folks listening are kind of hearing those themes and thinking about, I'm trying to exhibit those things in my case interview practice and kind of getting ready to try and break into this space. What would be one piece of advice that you had for someone who wanted to break into a firm like Mitchell Madison?
Yeah, I think it depends. It's obviously it's a huge draw, right? The consulting firms are hiring, huge chunks of MBA classes and what have you, right? So in general, I would say definitely do consulting. Like, I would advise anybody who's coming out of, college or MBA to try consulting, because if anything, it's a fantastic way of learning how executives think and not being boxed into any particular career. It gives you great flexibility and you learn a lot, right? So even if you end up hating it and you end up not doing it, I would definitely give it a try, do it for a few years, because you learn skills, like I said, in communication, in data, and to think like an executive that would take you many, many years in other industries to learn, right? So you would never think like that unless you've done that. And I think that's a huge advantage. And I think, in order to break into that, you have to have the skills that people are looking for, right? I think given the demand that's out there, it's probably a really great time to break into consulting. It's probably easier than it was, 10, 20 years ago. And I think you just have to be willing to, get good at this interview process, right? You have to show how you're thinking. You have to show an approach. You have to understand, logical reasoning, inductive, deductive law, just the basic stuff, right? And a very basic understanding of numeracy, right? If you can demonstrate that you have structured thinking, that you can, do a few numbers in your head, and then you can express that, I think you can get a job in consulting. I mean, it sounds a little flippant, but I think you could actually.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We'll be right back after this quick message.
Are you looking for a consulting role in a fast-paced environment where you work side by side with senior leaders on engagements across industries and project types? Then Stacks Inc. might be the perfect firm for you. This boutique strategy consultancy is currently hiring for a number of roles in its strategy practice. With compensation on par with other top boutiques, Stacks is an attractive place to start or continue your consulting career. Find open positions, plus job descriptions and requirements at the link in the show notes.
We would be amiss if we didn't try and pick your brain a little bit in the areas in which you're an expert while we have you here on the line. So, you are a global leader in terms of, understanding and being able to optimize cross-sector supply chains. What are one or two pieces of advice on how companies can adapt in the face of supply chain disruption that we've seen globally?
Yeah, this is a huge question, especially for me, right? Like I said earlier, we do a lot of strategic sourcing, and that really means creating a new supply chain, based on optimizing, mostly around price, around cost, right, and making sure it's efficient. Now, if you're in an environment where prices are going up and you're just begging for supply and you're trying to just get those microchips to make those Ford F-150s and you can't, that's a little tougher, right? So I'm personally very interested to see how this shakes out. So it's all about inflation, right? I mean, is there really inflation? And it's a macro question. What we're looking at right now, right? The fact that ocean shipping is 10 times more expensive. You can't get, my pool guy can't get chlorine, right? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? And which is why I'm not taking a swim right now. No, but I mean, it's there's so many supply chain disruptions. So the question is this a transitory feature of an economy restarting after everybody thought we're walking off a cliff? And I think yes, I think that's what it is, right? Because people have a really hard time understanding how complex the supply chain is, and you make one decision, right? You are like a car rental company, and you make a decision to sell all your cars, right? That takes a really long time to rebuild. Supply chains are complex, sensitive, and if you put a monkey wrench into it, it takes a really long time to make it good again. So I think that PPI, CPI, so consumer and producer level inflation could happen, but I don't think so. I think it's unlikely. So what companies can do, though, and I think they should do that, is harden the supply chain a little bit, right? If anything else that we've seen is there's been a lot of optimization on supply chain around cost, but not a lot of optimization around redundancy, diversity, and resilience to shocks. I'm not saying that anybody can have a supply chain that produces N95 masks in the middle of a pandemic. That's probably a little bit much. But you got to be ready for, and this preceded the pandemic, right? I mean, the Trump-China tariffs caught a lot of people off guard, and I think there's a lot to be said for having robust supply chains, right? So I think that is something that people really ought to do, and there's some pretty vulnerable companies out there. But again, no matter what your problem is, right? I would say the worst reaction right now on the supply side is to panic and say, "Ooh, I can't do anything," right? Because logic and analysis is always useful, right? So even if you're worried about, am I even going to get chips? Am I even going to get, critical supplies? Where are my basic chemicals? I would still do analytical sourcing and go through the process, because just assuming that your current supplier is the only guy who can do it and that they'll drop you like a hot potato if you even ask somebody else is not a good strategy, right? You want to be analytical about this. And I think the same tools work, but they work in a different, for different, goal, really, right?
So no knee-jerk reactions, recognize the long-term implications of changes, but still be critical and analytical about what you're doing right now, that there's room for improvement. So what is the role then? How do you see external consulting firms shaping supply chain diversification for companies?
Well, it's the same thing, right? I mean, look, I mean, the work that needs to be done, right? Supply chains are super complex, and there's a lot of legwork that needs to be done. And no company, even the largest companies out there, have or should have the capability to do that, because you don't have to do it all the time, right? I mean, you have a supply chain and you really optimize for something, right? And people have mostly optimized for cost and sort of taken everything else, especially diversity has taken a backseat. And I think it's time you have to redo that, or the next crisis is going to hit you really, really hard. And that's an analytical process. And I think you'd be crazy to do it on your own, because the skills that you need to maintain a supply chain versus building one are completely different. right? This is an analytical process. It takes quite a bit of, brain cells. It takes quite a bit of expertise and approach, and, hire people who've done it before. And again, even in this supply constrained environment, we're finding monetary savings, we're finding results, and this is an ongoing problem, right? I mean, we have done a lot of we have a lot of conversations in the healthcare sector now. I mean, I find healthcare really interesting. You might, historically, for example, Mitchell Madison has done a very little work on the health insurance and healthcare side, right? Because it's always increasing, and you can say, oh, I found you some savings versus some increasing baseline. It would have been worse. Not a good selling proposition, right? But what we're finding now is with the pandemic and the effect of remote working, is that you have to approach an issue like health insurance in a totally different way, right? Now you want to know, wait a second, where do people live, right? And where do they work? So where's the person that is on my payroll that's really a San Francisco company? Well, the guy actually works out of Utah, right? And hospitals in Utah are very different from hospitals and cost-wise, very different from hospitals in San Francisco. And there's a very different health profile. And so this whole area of HR, right? Health insurance, benefits, costs has become all of a sudden really interesting, right? And it's really interesting for companies because the balance of using contingent workforce versus on the payroll has become much more complex all of a sudden. And so we're doing a lot of work in that space.
Hans, it's been a pleasure to talk with you this morning, kind of pick your brain, hear more about you and the firm, the space in which you work. For those who'd like to learn more about Mitchell Madison, what's the best way for them to get to know the firm?
Well, listen to the interview, of course. That's the best. No, I think, the normal, you just go on our website or, contact us. I mean, we're always happy to talk to people. We're always, in the market interviewing. We're looking for, good people. We're looking for creative people with a good fit. So, just open up a conversation. There's a lot of information about us. Look at our publications to get a sense of how we think. I think that'll be good.
Perfect. And it sounds like you're hiring. Yeah.
Well, look, I mean, we're a boutique firm, right? We're always looking. We're not like, the big guys that go in these massive cycles with recruiting targets. But yes, we're always looking.
Hans, really appreciate the time again today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us today. Global supply chain disruption is something most of us have been impacted by in one way or another from this COVID era. And it's a space that firms will continue to have to firm up and optimize moving forward. It's been great to learn from Hans, a global thought leader in this space, as well as learn more about Mitchell Madison. If you're interested in working for a firm like Mitchell Madison Group, check out our information and offerings at www.managementconsulted.com, where you'll find resources to help you understand the consulting interview process, get the interview, and prepare.